afternoon. I'm Mike Better, the Director of the National Nanotechnology Coordination Office. We're here today at the National Science Foundation Center for High-rate Nanomanufacturing at Northeastern University in Boston to discuss opportunities and challenges of being a small business in the nanotechnology space. I'm joined today by Dr. Marcie Black, the co-founder and CEO of the Advanced Silicon Group, and Victor Vazins, who's the CEO of NanoC. Before we hear from our guests, I want to give you a little background. The National Nanotechnology Initiative, or the NNI, is a coordinated initiative within the federal government to sponsor high-tech, cutting-edge nanotechnology R&D, world-class user facilities, training and education of the next generation of scientists, and the responsible development of nanotechnology. In all, 20 agencies collaborate under the NNI, working toward a common shared vision of a future in which the ability to understand and control matter at the nanoscale will lead to a revolution in technology and industry that benefits society. So I'm the director of the National Nanotechnology Coordination Office. We provide technical and administrative support to the NNI. We coordinate multi-agency planning, prepare budget documents, support outside assessments, and maintain the NNI website, nano.gov, and do other outreach activities, especially to small businesses and student groups. This webinar and those that precede it, we've had two prior ones, is part of an effort for us to better understand and highlight the challenges that small businesses and medium-sized businesses face in commercializing nanotechnology, but also highlighting their success stories so that businesses that are starting out can learn from the successes of those companies that have worked in this area. This webinar is this and the other webinars are available on our website, nano.gov, and this one will be available in about 1 week to 10 days from now. Before we start, I also wanted to mention two events that the NNI and the NNCO are involved in. The first is we are doing an update of our strategic plan, and on May 19th and 20th in Washington, D.C. at Patriots Plaza, we are having a stakeholders workshop, a 2-day stakeholders workshop. So I invite you, if you have a chance, to either attend that workshop in person or it will be broadcast live. We also have a request for information out to identify commercial success stories that have arisen from support from the NNI, and you can find a link to both of those on the nano.gov website. I'd also like to thank Dr. Ahmed Busanena and Eric Howard and the staff here at the Northeastern University Center for High-rate Nanomanufacturing for their help in organizing this event. And also want to thank Mike Kiley, Kristen Roy, and Marlo Newman from my office for their help in putting this together. So that's enough for me. What I'd like to do is introduce our two panelists. First is Dr. Marcie Black, who is the CEO and co-founder of the Advanced Silicon Group. Prior to founding ASG, Dr. Black held positions on the technical staff at Los Alamos National Lab, the engineering staff at Motorola, and was the co-founder of Bandgap Engineering. In 2010, she was named one of the women to watch by Mass High Tech, and ASG, her current company, makes low-cost nanowire arrays for use in photovoltaic arrays and in devices to detect biological contaminants. Victor Vazins is the president and CEO of NanoC Incorporated, based just outside of Boston. Prior to being the president and CEO of NanoC, he led an advanced material startup fund company funded exclusively by Cabot Corporation to target the transportation-related applications. And then prior to joining Cabot, he was a management consultant with Arthur D. Little and at A.T. Kearney in chemicals and materials. NanoC is commercializing nanostructured carbon-based materials and chemicals for applications in electronics and renewable energy. So what I'd like to do is start with Marcie and ask you to tell us a little bit about the Advanced Silicon Group. What's the origin of the company? What are your company objectives? What market segments are you interested in?
Thanks, Mike.
Sure.
So first, I wanted to thank you for having this seminar and for the NNI in general. I have to admit, when you first invited me, I didn't know much about the NNI, so I did a little research, and I learned that the U.S. has been supporting nanotech since 1999, yeah. And has continued support from many administrations. So, for example, President Clinton was quoted in 2000 saying some of our research goals may take 20 years to achieve or more, and that is precisely why there's an important role for the federal government. So I think roughly 20 years later, a little bit less, I still think that's the case, and I think it's really important that we support materials development and not just software development, and nanotech is a big part of that. As a result of our support, I was surprised to learn that nanotech-enabled products, the revenue in 2012 was $731 billion. So we've been very successful in encouraging nanotech development. So my career path has been less focused on doing nanotech, but more focused on the application, which has led me to nanotech. So I've been very interested in solar cells or photovoltaics, and that's because that's where my interest in electronic materials and my desire to help with the energy problem in the world energy crisis overlapped. So early on, I worked at Motorola as a device engineer, which is the basis, semiconductor processing is the basis of solar cells. So that's where I learned solar cells. And then afterwards, I got my PhD. I was lucky enough to work with Professor Dresselhaus, and we worked on the optical properties of nanowires. And then I got a postdoc at Los Alamos National Labs. It was a director's-funded postdoc, so they let me do whatever I wanted and gave me resources to do it. So that was a dream come true. So I worked on nano and organic PV, and then as a technical staff member there, I spun out the technology that was developed there to start my first company, Bandgap Engineering. So Bandgap Engineering was focused on using nanowires and silicon nanotexture to improve the efficiency of silicon solar cells. So we went about 8 years and raised about $10 million, both from VC investment and from grants, and developed the technology to improve the efficiency of solar and lower the cost. And then Bandgap was sold, and Advanced Silicon Group purchased the IP. So Advanced Silicon Group is commercializing the technology developed by Bandgap Engineering. But we're doing it a little differently. So we're using the silicon nanowire arrays, and we're partnering with companies in different expertise to help them incorporate the nanowires into their product for improved performance and lower cost, and then providing them the license to commercialize the technology. So we're focused on two markets specifically right now. The first is solar cells, because the technology was already all developed at Bandgap, so it's ready to be commercialized. So in that technology, we're partnering with cell manufacturers to help them make the most use of this technology and get the highest efficiency cells on their line, and then providing them the license to manufacture under our IP. And in doing so, it allows them to double their margins without buying new equipment. So it's a win-win. And then the other field that we're looking at is biomedical devices. So because the nanowires have a very high surface area, they're very sensitive to the atmosphere around them. So we're using this sensitivity to make very selective and sensitive detectors. So the first product we're looking at is a biosensor to look for cancer in the blood. And the idea is that you can do a blood test and determine if you have cancer, and not only if you have cancer, but what type of cancer you have, which will allow you to have better targeted drug therapy. So the grand vision is to have early screening and early detection for cancer and have more effective treatment for better recovery. So we're looking at a wide range of applications, but the two that we're focused on are PV, are photovoltaics, and biosensors.
Thanks. So Victor, could you tell us about your company, the origin, what your objectives are, and what market segments you're interested in?
Absolutely, and thank you again for inviting me and sort of inviting us to this discussion. NNCO as a company was founded in 2001, so we've been a going concern for well over 15 years now. We're going into our 15th year, and it's been, as my guess, it's been a long haul. And one of the things that you learn in this whole whole field of nanotechnology that it is going to take a long time to develop these markets, develop these applications. I think you heard Marcie reference the whole notion of partnership, and I think that's a theme, at least through my discussion here. That's going to be a theme that kind of plays through. Whether that partnership is customer-oriented, product development-oriented, or at almost any other level, that becomes a very strong basis for how we've taken our technology forward. So the initial time frame, the 2001 to 2005 kind of time frame, was all about how to develop these materials, how to manufacture them, and then I joined the company in 2005 as CEO, so I joined it kind of midway. And the push kind of thereafter is, once you've defined how to make them, what the basic characteristics are, is really the push towards applications development. And that's where, again, this notion of partnership comes into play. So the applications that we initially focused on were, again, if you page back to that 2005, 2006 kind of time frame, was really all around organic photovoltaics. Again, so renewable energy was a big theme for us. That continues today, although in a slightly different way. As a materials company, we manufacture two types of materials, both carbon-based. One happens to be fullerene, otherwise known as a buckyball, and the other one is the longer version of that, which is the single-wall carbon nanotube. Both of these are made in our combustion-based manufacturing process. Again, that was the genesis of the company. And so now we've taken these two basic materials and developed chemistry that fits around them. So we consider ourselves to be process chemists, and really consider ourselves to have a core competency in the chemistry of these materials. So as we developed that chemistry, and then looking at the organic PV, we then later added in capability to functionalize fullerenes in a different way and apply them into semiconductor manufacturing. So for applications such as photolithography and for what are called spin-on carbon hard masks. So we've developed that capability in the context of fullerenes, and then in the context of single-wall carbon nanotubes. They have a much broader, I think, applications development portfolio or ability. And so we've taken the focus in on print electronics, ranging from printable semiconductor backplanes through to transparent conducting films for displays and touchscreens. And then one of the key applications that we've got going today is with actually a local Boston-based company by the name of NNCO, located up in Woburn, Mass., where we've been working with them for probably since their inception, about 10 years now, on carbon nanotubes for memory-related applications. So as we look down our portfolio, where electronics and energy are the two broad buckets. Within energy, it's by and large the organic photovoltaic. We're also then working on coatings for fuel cells, which is another sort of interesting application that brings us to Northeastern quite frequently. And then beyond that, in the sensor, organic photodetector, printable transistors, and transparent conductors. So we're at a point now where we have these sort of 4 or 5 areas of focus. It's all about the chemistry of materials. Our path to market is always through a partner or with a partner, because we don't have the capability to be in depth in all of these sectors. So we bring to bear the chemistry, and then rely on customers or academic partners really to develop that kind of end application. So we're at a point today, it's now 2016, where we're at that point, hopefully, of transitioning from being a development-oriented company to now being much more manufacturing-oriented. We have customers that towards the end of this year are moving into their own scale-up phase. So we're now transitioning to the point of having commercial scale equipment and facilities starting up later this year, going into 2017. So we hope that this is the inflection point year for NanoC and for our customers.
Great, thank you. So as your company was moving on its path to success, what were the chief obstacles that you encountered along the way? And what did you do to try to overcome those obstacles?
I get to go first.
If you wish.
So Interestingly, so I'm going to answer more generally because ASG is actually a fairly new company. Interestingly, in my career path, it has never been technology development. I've always been lucky to have a really good tech team, and we've been able to hit all the milestones. I'd say in medical devices right now, and that challenge changes, right? So right now in our medical devices, we know we have a sensor that's more sensitive than what's on the market, and we know we can detect multiple antigens or proteins on the same chip. So the challenge is trying to find the right market for where that adds value. So that's the challenge right now in the medical field, where we're doing a lot of customer discovery to try to figure that out. In solar, the market is really competitive right now, and it's very challenging, as you know.
Yeah.
And I think for a small company in today's environment, it's difficult to find ways to monetize your IP in this world market. So I'd say that's the challenge in PV.
Yeah, I would have to echo some of those same comments. In particular, I would say one of the big challenges that we have is sometimes the asymmetric nature of our partners, where today, again, if you look at our website, you'd see that one of our major partners is Merck Chemical. Merck Chemical is a $12 or $20 billion chemical company, huge, and they've got their own path, their own mindset to work down. You as a startup have just much more, greater sense of focus, greater sense of urgency. You need to get things done more quickly. So it's really trying to deal and manage that kind of relationship. That's always challenging. And then thereafter it's the usual challenges of technology development, cost and consistency, scale up, as being some of the major points.
So you're working then with large companies, but what are sort of the challenges in developing these partnerships and working with other companies, and how have you tried to deal with those challenges?
We deal both with large companies like Merck, and then we have partnerships with smaller companies like NNCO, as an example. Another company that we're working with is out of the UK, Irresistible Materials, and they're the ones really in this photolithography space. I supply the chemistry, they do the applications development work, and then we together are going to market. Major challenges are, for the larger companies, again, it's overcoming a sense of inertia that the larger companies have,
right?
Because their timelines can run longer. As a startup, you're always looking at your cash position, what needs to happen next, your next raise, can you make it to that goal, and all those pieces come into play. And if you don't have the longer term backing, that's when things start to get a bit more bumpy.
Yeah. Any other thoughts?
Yeah. Again, I think another issue is time is an issue in different timelines. I agree, but also like protecting your proprietary information is a challenge.
Yeah.
Their barrier to market is that they already have a brand name, and they have lots of resources and lots of money and lots of people. A lot of times in nanotech, our barrier to market is that we have novel intellectual property, so we have to protect that.
So do you jump in with the question? Do you then patent, or do you just really kind of rely on know-how?
We do both. Right. It's a constant question of what do you patent and what do you leave as trade secret. Yeah.
Yeah, a similar.
Similar challenge. We tend to, if it's applications oriented, we tend to work on patents for that. If it's more process oriented, then we tend to leave that more as know-how.
Okay.
Yeah, it's a little different for us because we're teaching people how to do our process, so we're more heavily dependent on patents, I imagine.
So there are a lot of ingredients that are believed to be important in building a company, whether it's knowledge of the target market or capitalization or IP. Talk a little bit about that.
Yeah.
Your technical approach. We talked about partnerships, but what would you consider to be key to building and sustaining a company? Is it the partnerships? Is it what do you think?
would say people. If you have the right people, then the rest of that will all come into play. I know that I feel like that's a cop-out.
Yeah. Well, I think people are definitely vital. I've been just sort of blessed with a great team. My core team has been with me since I joined 2005. And so having that kind of resident capability, talented, brilliant, and sort of looking to add value all the time, that's sort of absolutely vital. But I think what you have to, it's like with any other business. It's really, it's about the customer. It's about understanding what their needs are. It's about, in our case, looking at the portfolio of not only materials that you manufacture that can solve their problem, but kind of looking beyond that and adding value in the sense that, well, there might be a better solution that doesn't really involve our materials, and why not then sort of go down that path with them.
Yeah.
Partnership, I think, is at least for nanomaterials anyway, where you're manufacturing them, is a key, certainly, and then having the right kind of technology development, applications development, capability within your own team is very important, and then having sort of a receptive audience in the sense of the customer and where that's going to go.
Yeah.
So you really have to understand from the market to the customer, application, characteristic of materials, cost structures, pricing, and then how do you build that IP sort of sustainable edge.
So how does a small company get exposure to the big companies like Merck or Boeing? Or how did you guys go about doing that?
It varied, really, and it still continues to vary today. We often participate in different sort of industry meetings.
Okay.
Where there's that usual kind of meet and greet during the course of the conference from a networking point of view.
Sure.
Those are all always very vital. And then even beyond that, if you can look to a particular company, like needing to get in to see someone at Samsung or Intel or whomever,
right?
You can begin to sort of pinpoint who you want to go after, and then it's really that, at least in our case, it's been that kind of one-on-one, getting to a meeting, and then getting to problem definition, and then hopefully getting to the next meeting, and then finally, moving beyond that and developing this tighter collaboration.
Yeah, in our case, in the medical field, it's been challenging because none of my co-founders really have a background there.
Right.
It's helpful. One of my partners, Fatima Tour, is at University of Iowa, and there's a lot of biomedical people in that area, as well as in Boston, where I am located. In the solar field, it's been easier because both my co-founder, Bill Reaver, and myself have been in the solar field for most of our career. So between the two of us, we know most of the major companies and people in the high levels of those companies. So it hasn't been as challenging. But when you're trying to get in a field that you don't know as well, it is harder.
So when your company was just getting started, what was the best piece of advice that you received and followed? And then the converse is, what was the best piece of advice that you didn't take but felt you should have?
Yeah. The best piece of advice is, as Marcie mentioned earlier, it's all about people.
Yeah.
It's all about people, getting the best people in, creating that atmosphere where you're in it together. That's kind of absolutely vital. That's always been a very strong piece of advice. And sometimes, at least for me in particular, you hang on too long. And it's always very difficult when you've got to think about letting someone go. But you've got to find the right capability, bring them in. If it doesn't work, recognize that early, and it's better for both parties then at that point to move on.
Well, sometimes the company outgrows the company grows, and then it's no longer the right person.
Right. Yep. Exactly.
I think my my most memorable piece of advice was when I was starting my first company, and I was debating, there's always the right before you jump, right? Jump out of the plane with your parachute on. And I was having a little bit of hesitation, and I spoke to the CEO of Psionics, another nanotech company, Steve Saylor. Yep. And he was talking to me about it, and he looked me straight in the eye and said, there's risk in starting your company, but there's also risk in not starting your company. Yep. And to me, that meant I had this great idea that I felt could really make a difference in the energy problem and could make solar more efficient. And I didn't want to live my life and never know whether that would really be able to have made a difference. So that was the most memorable piece of advice that I took. I think being an entrepreneur, you get a lot of advice, and I'm lucky to have a lot of great mentors. The trouble is you don't have time to take all the advice, even all the good advice. You just don't have enough time to do it. So the trick is trying to figure out which one's the most important to take.
Yeah, that's the notion of focus.
Yeah.
And you have to do that. And as CEOs, that's one of your primary jobs, really, is to figure out, out of that advice, what are you going to take? What are you going to do? How are you going to look at it? Because Marcie's right, you can't do it all. Yeah. Even on 24 hours a day.
Some of it's not good advice, but even among the good advice, it's hard to find the time to.
Yeah.
So if you were to advise individuals that are considering whether to start a company based on nanotechnology or delivering services to nanotechnology companies, what would you tell them? You talked about people and partnerships both being critical to the success, but what else what other wisdom would you impart to?
Well, firstly, not to look at nanotechnology as a pathway, but to really think about what specific problem are you looking to address? What specific value can the technology that you have, what can that provide to either a set of customers, a market, or broadly underlying as a platform technology. I think that's vital. Yeah. Nanotechnology per se, it addresses so many aspects, ranging from Intel today or Samsung or whomever, working at 10, 14 nanometer type scales in terms of imaging, which has been going on now for decades. The sort of ongoing progress of Moore's law, all the way through to you come up with this new nanowire, and how are you going to apply that? Who's going to apply it? What's the value to be created through it?
Yeah, I definitely agree that you have to get the application first. But once you find a market that you want to go after, and if you happen to end up in the nanotech market, I think one of the biggest things that you need to be careful of is that you can return you can get a good IRR on your time and your money. So thinking about how much money you're going to need to get to cash flow positive, and how fast that can happen. And because of all this investment in nanotech that's happened, there are areas where you can take a nanotech product and get a nice quick return and a good return. But you have to be careful because not all the technology is ready yet for commercialization. So I'd say try to get to a big return fast.
Yeah.
Find a market that you can do that.
So we talked about people, and as CEOs, you are sort of on the consuming end of STEM education. Do you see the talent pools getting better and more diverse? Is it easier now to find the right people that you want with the right skills and backgrounds, or than perhaps when you started in 2005?
Yeah, we really haven't had a major issue in doing that. As a general kind of theme, when you get down to some of the specific areas that we work in, just as one example, combustion chemistry. There's so few people in so few places in the world that actually practice that today, that you're really kind of almost, you want to say sorting through a haystack to get to the needle, because you know where those needles happen to be in terms of educational tools. But that kind of capability, very specialized capability, is sometimes harder to come by. The organic chemists that we work with, or the chemical engineers that we work with, that kind of talent is there, at least in the Boston area. Sure.
I haven't had trouble hiring good people. I've also been very fortunate to always work with amazing people. But I think that's because both of us haven't hit the growth stage. I mean, I think that will change as you move into manufacturing and you need to hire hundreds of people. Then the challenge might flip. I have noticed that the younger people are better trained than I was in working in a team, and that's really important. And it's something that you can learn, so it's not a showstopper. But I do feel like they're getting trained better in school at that. As far as technical competence, I haven't noticed a change.
Yeah, I guess I'd put a plug in for Northeastern's co-op program here. We actually bring on at least one co-op student every term, and for both for the student and for us is to get the student hands-on training and the ability to work within a team. That's been a great thing for us, as well as hopefully then for the student. And so I think they provide kind of a good grounding in terms of people development and capability that whether we hire them ultimately as they move through a co-op or some other company hires them, having that capability is pretty important. And Northeastern certainly does a great job at that.
Yeah. So in addition to developing skills in teamwork, I think that there's a lot of emphasis these days in universities on entrepreneurship and innovation. And do you find those skills to be useful in the employees that you're bringing into your companies? I mean, you're both entrepreneurs, so obviously, personally, you benefited from that. But do you see those skills as being important in the employees that you hire?
I don't know. I mean, I think in today's society, as opposed to like my parents' generation, I think any job has risk. So I think that the stereotype that startups have more risk is not necessarily true anymore. And so I was going to say one of the big benefits of this program is that it teaches people that failure is okay and that it's okay to take risk. But then again, so I was going to say maybe that helps us, but maybe it doesn't, because I don't really feel like any job nowadays is terribly secure, even in large companies.
Yeah.
So I don't know if it's.
Yeah, I think what you want to do is hire people that are, at least in our case, sort of naturally curious and have a drive and have an ambition to really kind of research and get at, ask questions. Yeah. And not be afraid to fail. It's a different demand than working in maybe more of a standard manufacturing approach. Okay. Ultimately, once you perhaps get into a sort of manufacturing sequence where things are standardized and need to proceed in a certain way. Right. There's less of it in that environment, but certainly where we are today, having that sort of entrepreneurial or questioning, curious mindset has been important.
Okay. So is there any aspect of running your business that takes a great deal of time and energy and that you did not even consider when you started your company? Or are there surprises that you've had in that regard?
I would say fundraising.
Okay.
So whether that be, in our case, we're not raising around, but in our case right now, it means writing grants. I spend a lot of my time writing grants and figuring out which grants to write and meeting with program managers. And but if you go the other route and you raise money, I think that also is all-consuming of the CEO.
Yeah. Yeah, fundraising is the...
I did not expect that. I don't know about you. But other companies.
Well, it's interesting. I didn't expect it to be as significant as it is.
Yeah.
We knew it was going to be a big job, but
yeah.
it's turned out to be a much bigger job.
Right, exactly.
And that's good and bad from a time management standpoint. Other challenges were really around the intellectual property development. How do you protect yourself?
Right.
And certainly the cost of doing so is not cheap. It's a big expense. I think in our case, if you look at employees as being the major expense, the next one right under that is IP development. And that's again something that when I was working at Cabot, you didn't necessarily see that expense because that was a corporate expense, and now you're absorbing it directly.
Yeah.
And so you see that very clearly. So that's one thing that came up as sort of surprising.
So when you look at managing your IP, how do you make a decision about which things you do patent and which things you do keep as your own proprietary?
For us, it's all very much case specific.
Yeah.
Again, if it's sort of like a unique molecule,
right.
It's pretty readily then we think about a patent there.
Okay.
Or the application of a molecule.
Right.
We think about a patent there. If it's the way to make it, then we more opt for keeping that as know-how.
Yeah. Is that the same approach that you take?
No, we tend to patent more because we're teaching people how to use our process.
Yeah. Okay.
But we do keep deep details because there's no longer best mode requirement in patent law.
Okay.
You don't want to go talk about that too much, but so we don't have to go into all the details. We have to explain how to get to the result, but not necessarily the best way to get to the result. So we keep a lot of that proprietary and confidential, and then patent the big picture. I specifically try to patent device claims as opposed to process claims because they're easier to enforce.
Right.
So, yeah, as opposed to how you get there, what you end up with is a stronger claim.
Yeah.
And our big question is not so much what to patent, it's more where we patent. Because we work in an international market, and the biggest cost is international cost. So that we look at the market, where the market's going, and we have to look at both where it's being, the solar cells or the product is being manufactured, and where it's being used and deployed. So that's constant feedback that we're putting into our IP strategy.
Yeah. The other aspect, it's not it's a challenge that we recognize coming in is the whole, from this nanomaterial standpoint, it's that health, safety, and environmental issues around nanomaterials per se. So we've taken a lot of time to work with NIOSH, work with the EPA, to really invite them into what we're doing, to let them see how we manage, invite their suggestions in terms of how to do things better, and that takes again a certain amount of time. Given the fact that most of these materials that we work with are relatively new, it's important for both the company and I think the regulator to really kind of explore this together, recognizing that ultimately it's got to be safe from a broad standpoint, as well as then economic in terms of how customers can use it and apply it.
So on the subject of safety and workforce, when you're looking for new employees, how important is it that they have a good foundation in safe practices, laboratory safety practices? And what do you do with them to train them, give them additional training once you bring them on?
Yeah, I was going to say, in the ideal world, they have it coming in.
Right.
In some cases, they don't. And then we have a training program that we set up to engage them in not only sort of how to handle the materials, what's important. We have a range of safety training programs that we take people through, and that's an ongoing process throughout the year, both for new employees as well as existing employees.
So interestingly, that's the one exception to my hiring rule, and my hiring rule is that you hire first on, like you had said earlier, on drive and intelligence,
right?
And much less so on skill set. But when it comes to safety, it's really nice if they already know how to work safely. And so luckily, all the engineers that I've hired, well, there's been a few exceptions, but most have already been trained in semiconductor processing, which is very transferable to what we do.
Sure.
So we're lucky in Boston to have companies like Skypark, where there's a good host of people that know how to do semiconductor processing. When these people don't, you have to put them through training, because it's very important.
Yeah. So you worked in a national lab. You've been getting funding from different agencies. You've worked with NIOSH and EPA, but what other ways has your company benefited from interactions with NNI agencies and the resources that they have, whether it's user facilities or collaboration with scientists in federal or national labs or direct funding?
Early on we were absolutely blessed by being able to work with the NSF, DOE, NIST, had the ATP funding, later TIP funding.
Right.
So early on we had monies coming in from the National Science Foundation to prove out some of these basic processes, basic manufacturing approaches, and that's what really sort of gave us a bit of a flywheel at the beginning to get some of these things going.
Yeah.
Over the years and through some of these relationships that we've developed, whether it happens to be here at Northeastern or UMass Lowell, UMass Amherst, just locally, not to mention Harvard and MIT, we have worked over time with all of these institutions, and then added in over the years, for example, working with the lab out in Berkeley,
okay.
The specific, like the micro-exposure tool,
okay,
out in Berkeley. So having access, to these kinds of facilities, the scientists that are there, the capability that resides there, or in any of these locations, has been really, really vital. Not only from the beginning in terms of understanding, but being able to access everything from characterization equipment that may be unique and very high cost if we were to get that on our own, all the way through to understanding of some of these key applications.
So we've already mentioned a lot of the ways.
Yeah.
We've gotten a few grants, and you mentioned having access to trained students and faculty that have specialized tools that you can use. But in addition to that, so I agree with all that, we also used Harvard CNS Lab, which I believe is funded by you guys.
Yeah.
So that was really useful when we were just starting, and in particular when we didn't know which equipment we would need. So it allows you to get in with a fairly low cost to get started on some research. Once you focus in on using a couple tools, it quickly becomes more cost-effective to own your own. But when you're starting out, it's very useful.
Yeah. So,
like seed rounds.
Yeah, right. So you both have benefited from user facilities, and it sounds like you use them quite a bit. Do you find that there are any impediments to getting into these user facilities that could need to be addressed, or do you find the access is pretty easy?
For us, I would say the access has been relatively, easy. In some of these cases, depending upon the nature of how one gets into the facility, it can be still rather expensive.
Sure.
Right.
Depending upon the tool that you're looking to use.
Yeah, I was going to say the same thing. I feel like the training is reasonable. I mean, we just talked about the need for training. So I felt like the training was very focused and very reasonable. And the big barrier for us is the cost. It's not cheap.
Yeah. So So we had a question from the audience about insurance and insuring both products and workers. What's been your experience in trying to do that? And if you've had some challenges, what have you done to address those and overcome them?
We have not had challenges. I think we don't have a lot of the challenges other nanotech companies because our nanowires, it's like a shag carpet. They're all attached.
Okay.
So I mean, we need insurance. You know, we
Sure.
need corporate insurance, and like we have insurance, so it wasn't a challenge to get insurance. Sorry. But,
I would say the same thing. We're in fact insured through Lloyd's. Ultimately.
Okay.
So it's out there. It's not difficult to come by. On the other hand, it still is quite expensive to come by. So it's really all about understanding the risks that go behind each of these materials, and then relative to your workers. And if that's well defined, then insurance looks at it in a much different way than if it's undefined.
I mean, I'm sure you have too. I've heard of stories of nanotech companies that have had challenges with insurance. So
Sure.
the question's relevant, not to our particular
Yeah.
company.
But I would imagine that the fact that you've worked with organizations like NIOSH and others to try to ensure that you've got good workplace safety practices probably.
Yeah, all of that helps.
Yeah.
And as sort of more and more research is done on different types of nanomaterials that we manufacture, as that has come out, and it's come out in fact more favorably, that again sort of lessens the the concern that would have been say present 10 years ago or 7 years ago. Yeah. So with with time and with work, it's been good that it's actually gone our way.
Yeah.
There was obviously the probability that could have gone the other way.
Right.
And that sets up a whole another set of issues. But right now it's I think looking quite good.
So one question that we have talked about in the NNCO is that if you had 5 minutes with President Obama,
Oh gosh.
okay, and you to talk with him about commercialization of nanotechnology and how the federal government could better help in that area, what would you tell him?
You can go first.
Well, I think one place we could strengthen is really our IP policy. I'm actually a very strong supporter of Obama, but I think that the changes in the intellectual property law were not good. Some of them are not good. So I would talk to him about developing a very strong intellectual property strategy and also helping other countries strengthen their IP laws as well. So for us, that's a big issue, and it sounds like talking to other nanotech startups, that's also a big issue.
Yeah, I think that's a big issue, and then
It's a tough question.
well, it's a tough question because how far do you go? And one of my thoughts has always been that there's a vehicle or a pathway for the federal government to fund research and development. So like the whole SBIR programs and that kind of thing is very important. Increasing that over time is very important. You don't want to turn companies into what used to be called the SBIR houses and just turning the turning the crank. On the other hand, that funding has been going down over time, and so increasing that I think is important from the federal government point of view. Increasing the funding around would be generally helpful, like the environmental assessments. That would be a second area that I would see. I think the government tried these large-scale debt guarantees and whatnot, and don't have any data in front of me to know whether that was successful or not. But there are elements in that type of program where, as we look to scale up our systems, yes, there is a certain amount of risk there, and if that can be co-funded somehow, I think there's an element there also.
Yeah, I think we do an amazing job supporting R&D, but I think there's improvement in supporting the products that come out of that R&D to commercialization. I think in the past we've expected the private sector to take over that, and they don't always take it over because there's still a lot of work from when it comes out of the university or lab to when it turns into a product. And so they aren't always willing to pay for that.
Yeah, they're. I think oftentimes not willing to pay for that, and then you have to really sort of think about, well, if they're not, are you really focusing on the right questions then?
Or maybe it's too early. Is my part.
Or maybe it's too early. Yeah.
So you talked about IP being an issue, potential issue in working internationally. Have you seen any other challenge? You're both working a little bit internationally. Have you seen any other challenges, like the regulatory environment or special challenges in working internationally that you don't see working here in the U.S.?
There are culture differences.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, regulatory-wise, certainly REACH in Europe is a much different kind of regulatory framework that we're having to work through.
Right.
As more and more that gets defined, you can find people that can help you through that process.
Okay.
So that's been good. Culturally, I was just in Japan, as an example, a couple of weeks ago. That has always been a unique culture to work in. Certainly there's always, not always, but oftentimes a language barrier, there that you've got to work through. And then there's just the whole, the time aspect where you're, 12 hours or whatever, kind of, out of sync.
Yeah.
And then how do you make that work?
Yeah.
And, in this work that we're doing in the photoresist space, as an example, we're working with, companies in Japan. We're based here in Boston, and our partners in the UK.
Right.
Or we have another partner in Korea. And so now you're coordinating a teleconference.
Yeah.
So the question is, who gets up in bed to make the call? But you make it work.
Yeah.
I think we haven't had to worry about the government per se because of the partnership. So there might be challenges in language barrier or whatever working with the partner, but the partner is the one that's working with their government.
Yeah.
So I think that helps a lot when you have the right partner in another country.
Yeah. So you mentioned working with NIOSH and EPA. Has that made it easier to do fundraising? Does it sort of de-risk what you're doing any, or?
It hasn't made it any easier from a fundraising point of view, but it certainly de-risks everything. So our investors, our current investors, are heartened to know that we've gone through this process. They've come in, and the findings are the findings, and we're operating down a good pathway.
Yeah.
And so any new investor that comes on, they benefit from that work that we've already done.
Yeah.
So it's a box that needs to be checked, but it doesn't put you over any kind of a bar.
Okay. And you mentioned that yours.
Yeah, that
But
question
they're met. Yeah. Right. Yeah.
Yeah.
So you talked about strategic partners, and to some extent about the importance of having the mentors at play. But can you elaborate on that a little bit more?
Well, I've been fortunate to have some really great mentors. I'm not sure what you want to say, but I feel like I've always had people that mentor me. I have maybe a handful of really core mentors that I go to for advice in different areas. So one of them's an entrepreneur, so when it's more like raising a fund raising a round or building a team, I would talk to him. And I also have technical mentors, so when it's more of a technical question, I would go to that person. I'm not sure.
Yeah.
But
Thoughts on mentors?
I think, sorry, there's a lot to know, that you need to know starting a company, and
right.
At least when I went to school, there wasn't a place where you learn that. So the way that I've learned it is by talking to other entrepreneurs, and we help each other.
Right.
Yeah, well, I think the single biggest piece of advice that I could probably offer someone is, don't be afraid to ask for help, kind of like anywhere along the way. And if it's someone that you happen to know, that has the expertise that can be brought in, great. And if it's not, find someone that can help you out in whatever area. Oftentimes, what you'll find is that there is someone out in your network that knows, or has seen the kinds of challenge that you're facing.
Yeah.
And whether it's again, sort of the asymmetric nature of working with a big company, or strategically what to do, fundraising, what to do. There's a wealth of experience out there, and being able to ask for help is
I think leading a company, you don't necessarily have to be the smartest person, but I think the key is knowing what you don't know and knowing who to ask when you have a question.
Yeah, and it's actually from the hiring point of view, again, hiring people that are bright and capable and smarter
than you in a certain area. Yeah.
It's a good piece of advice too.
Yeah.
Right. Also today, I hope that first of all, I'd like to thank Marcie and Victor again. I hope that this webinar has given folks some more insight into what it takes to be successful in the nanotechnology space and what the challenges are. And I want to thank the audience for joining us, and stay tuned for our next one that will talk about insurance, I believe. So thanks.
Thank you.
Thanks.